All right, this is part 2, starting at concept 23.4 from chapter 23, of course. Natural selection we touched on previously promotes or maintains favorable genotypes, and those that are favorable are those that encourage reproduction or are more likely to reproduce. Because those genotypes are favored, they accumulate. So sometimes genetic variation is not inherited or heritable. Here are the environmental conditions that are different based on the time that these butterflies are born. They emerge in spring versus late summer. Their phenotypic color is different. So genetic variation can occur, and it's not necessarily always heritable. Now, in a population, variation, as described, it can have both discrete and quantitative characters that contribute to that population. Sort of a complicated way of saying discrete characters are sort of the yes or no, the black or white. For example, short or tall. You can be big A, or you can be little a. There's heterozygous, of course, but they're still big, so short or tall. Whereas quantitative characters vary along a continuum. You might be 6'1", or 6 foot, or 5'11", or 5'10", or 5'9", and so on. They vary along a continuum. Those would be quantitative characters. So these phenotypic characteristics contribute to your morph or your shape. So polymorphism is varying shapes for a certain characteristic. So phenotypic polymorphism is a population where you have 2 or more distinct morphs, and they're in high enough frequencies that they're noticeable. So this is pretty typical. Phenotypic polymorphism is quite common. You have more than one morph for a character or a trait. That's noticeable. Genetic polymorphisms are essentially the same thing, where the heritable components of the characters, they vary along a continuum in a population. So here, this is why you see we described discrete and quantitative characters. Genetic polymorphisms would be more along a continuum, where phenotypic polymorphism only requires 2 as its definition to be noticeable, although phenotypic polymorphism can vary along a continuum as well. So population geneticists will look at the number of polymorphs in a population, and they'll often calculate the amount of heterozygosity that occurs, where the average heterozygosity is the average percent of the loci that are heterozygous in a population. And this provides information for them for the study of that specific population for a certain character trait. Now, a lot of species exhibit differences or changes in their gene pools based on where they live. They may even be next to each other. They may be the same species, but they'll exhibit some differences, as you can see here, even chromosomally in this example on the same island. These are going to, or are different species now. They will not be able to reproduce according to the biological species model. You'll see their karyotype here, the picture of their chromosomes is fairly different. Now, sometimes variation can occur based on environmental changes, or in this case, a cline, which is a graded change along a geographic axis. So as you get higher and higher on this mountain range, this increase in height allows for less air at those various heights, and thus the plants can't grow as tall. And in fact, as you get higher in altitude as well, the winds tend to increase, and stronger winds make plants shorter and stockier to withstand those winds. And this is also why at certain points on mountains, you don't see any more trees anymore. They've passed the points at which there's available carbon dioxide to survive. So natural selection will increase the frequency of certain genotypes because they're better fit for their environment, enabling them to reproduce. Some people call this survival of the fittest or struggle for existence. Those are pretty typical. They can be misleading because it's not about who survives, it's not about who exists, it's about who can reproduce, reproductive success. So we like to describe this in terms of reproductive success. Now, fitness, how well the individual is able to contribute to the next generation compared to the others, we call that relative fitness. We call that fitness, and the relative fitness is that which is compared to the other alternative genotypes at the same locus. So fitness and relative fitness, not the most important terms, but so there's different types of natural selection as we described. There's directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. Here they're written in terms, but here I like better graphically displayed. Here, directional selection favors one of the extremes. So here the dotted line represents the original population. Something favors, in this case, darker mice. The darker fur color, they're concealed better from predators. So the population slowly shifts towards this curve over time because there's going to be more darker mice. Here we have disruptive selection, where being the intermediate is disfavored. I think that's a word. The two extremes are favored, so over time the population, the middle fur color in this case, is minimized. And stabilizing selection, the intermediate is stabilized, where being on the extremes is bad, being in the middle is good. Now, different ways that genetic variation can be preserved. Well, we are diploid organisms, of course, so diploidy maintains genetic variation because there's recessive alleles that can be hidden. So this is a benefit, or part of the reason why we are diploid, because that helps to promote that variation or maintain the variation. So balancing selection basically occurs when natural selection will maintain essentially stable frequencies between two or more phenotypic forms in a population. So essentially one is not favored, but two are favored at about equal rates, two different phenotypes. And this leads to what we call balanced polymorphism, where again you have two or more different morphs that are favored. So sometimes being heterozygous is good. We call this heterozygote advantage. They have greater fitness than homozygous for some reason. It varies depending on the characteristic. The typical one that we talk about is sickle-cell anemia, where if you are homozygous dominant at that gene locus, you can get malaria. If you are homozygous recessive at that gene locus, you have sickle-cell anemia and you die pretty young. If you are heterozygous, you don't die of sickle-cell anemia and you are immune to malaria. So that is an advantage. So in areas where malaria is dominant, we'll show you soon, heterozygotes at that gene locus are very high. Here you see the protozoan that distributes the malaria. In dark red, this is the frequency of sickle cell allele increases in these dark red or darker patched areas because that's where malaria rates are highest. Now, sometimes it's within a population, there can be too many. At some point, there's too many in a population, so the fitness of any certain morph will decline if it's too common in that population. There just gets to be too many. It makes it too visible or too easy, or pushes out other members of the same morph, so some of them die off. This is frequency-dependent selection, when the frequency is too high. So here's an example where essentially this bird is pecking at the screen, and when the blue jay pecks on a moth image, it gets food. A little bit of food pops out. So here, the more there are of the same morph, the same phenotype, the easier it is to spot and to see, as you can tell, and thus more of the moths will die off, so to speak, from the bird eating them or pecking them than if there were different phenotypes. And you can see kind of here, it's described in the book a little better, of course. Sometimes variations are neutral. They don't provide any advantage one over the other, so sometimes it can encourage balanced polymorphism as well. And then sexual selection is natural selection for mating success. Sometimes this can cause sexual dimorphism, which basically just means differences between the sex, and these differences arise from secondary sex characteristics like hair growth or phenotypic traits like coloring and patterns and so on. That leads to intrasexual selection, which is direct competition between individuals of one sex for mates of the opposite sex. So this is your typical two male elk fighting over who gets to mate with the female. That would be intrasexual selection. Intersexual selection is when members of one sex are choosy in selecting their mates of the other sex. And this is often why the male in nature is, and I suppose in humans you could say too, they're just prettier. Like you see in this peacock. This is the male, very, very pretty, and the female peacock is actually quite ugly. Sorry, ladies. She gets to choose which male she wants to mate with. I suppose that's an advantage for the female, based on which male is the prettiest. So that's intersexual selection. Why does sexual reproduction even exist still? We've talked about the benefits of asexual reproduction. Look how many offspring you can produce. Sexual reproduction is not so good because you don't produce very many offspring. This reproductive handicap, if you like. Why has it persisted? Well, sexual recombination, sexual production promotes genetic variation that in part can aid in disease resistance. Offspring are going to be different, and some are favored over others. All right, and we are done.